Hey, I'm Alyssa the College Expert. Today, I want to talk to you about the test optional movement in colleges and how it's precluding colleges from being able to decide whether or not students are a good fit for it, and also how that rests on the nation's report card that just came out, the 4th grade and 8th grade math and reading data that shows that we're super behind and the pandemic's taken a tremendous toll on our students, as well as the article that Michael Bloomberg wrote about bringing back the SATs and ACTs. A lot to unpack there. But before I begin, please subscribe and hit the notification bell to turn on notifications. So today I want to talk about the Hechinger Report article that came out a couple days ago, talking about how colleges now are having a lot of trouble without SAT and ACT scores deciding who's a good fit for their college or not. In the first paragraph, they say, a third reader on an application was often called in to break a tie when one staffer said yes and another said no. Without SAT and ACT scores, he explained the job of admitting students had become more subjective and time-consuming. A lot of people have been saying, let's get rid of standardized test scores because GPA is a better predictor of how students will do in college. What that fails to take into account is that GPAs from different schools are different, right? So if you're going to a high SES, like a well-funded school, you have a 4.0, the colleges know what that means. If you go to a well-funded school and you have a 3.0, the colleges know what that means. But if you go to an extremely poorly funded school, you have a 4.0, colleges have absolutely no idea what that means. So when they're making comments like GPA is a better predictor, that is true when we understand the high school from which students are coming. I think it's a fallacious suggestion that eliminating SATs and ACTs is a good idea, because here's what happens instead. What they start doing is replacing standardized tests with other metrics that are even more biased towards wealthy and white prospective college students, like letters of recommendation and expensive extracurricular activities. They say here, one college purchased a data service that ranked high schools and factored those high school rankings into each application. So if you're going to an underserved school, obviously your high school's ranking is not going to be great, right? And these things are all really obvious. They say many admissions officers also are struggling with how to figure out if you did submit test scores versus you didn't, how do we weigh them fairly? And they describe a process that has become basically chaotic. And this is from a woman who went behind 22 admissions officers from 16 colleges and universities. And so she released these preliminary findings at the Association for Education, Finance, and Policy. And so basically what it sounds like is colleges have no idea how to evaluate applicants. And even colleges who have been test optional for longer now still have no idea how to evaluate applicants because they're getting so many more than they did in the past, because now that you don't have to submit tests, everybody and their mother is applying to every single college. If you've been watching my videos, you remember that Harvard had a 48% uptick in the number of applications they got in 2021, which means that if normally they get 20,000 applications, they got almost 30,000 that year. Colgate saw a 102% increase in its application. So that means if they normally get 10,000 applications, they got north of 20,000 this time, which is crazy, right? Because the staff that you have is able to read the number of applications that you normally get. If you're suddenly doubling that, that's insane. And college admissions offices aren't any different from other places in the pandemic that lost staff. So they're often also working with a skeleton staff, so they have fewer people to read these applications, more applications to read, and no rubric by which to evaluate them. So this is crazy, especially when the solution to that is often to use other rubrics that further disadvantage low SES students of color. Another piece of information that I thought extremely interesting: schools that went test optional between 2005, 2006, and 2015, 2016. So this is long before the pandemic. And they found that there was no significant change to diversity on campus as a result of implementing test optional policies. I just want to let that sit for a minute. No significant change. One of the big reasons behind test optional admissions is that students of color will have more of a fair shot. If you're bringing in metrics that are even further prejudiced towards white and wealthy students, that's not necessarily true, right? Again, if you can't evaluate the strength of the candidates' high schools, people aren't going to be willing to take a chance on a student who comes from a high school that they don't know anything about. They'd rather take a chance on somebody who they absolutely know everything about. One study published in 2021 found that the share of Black, Latino, and Native American students increased by only 1 percentage point at about 100 colleges and universities that adopted the policy between 2005, 2006, and 2015, 2016, which is way before the pandemic. So in that 10-year period, from 2005 to 2015, only increased diversity on campus by 1 percentage point for historically underrepresented minorities. Kind of crazy. What this all says to me is that the test optional movement is no panacea, and it was never a solution. And I don't know why everybody has been talking about it if the data does not back up that it actually has positive effects. One other thing that I've been hearing a lot is that post-pandemic college persistence is way down and grades in classes are way down. I'm sure you heard about the professor at NYU who was let go because of his poor course evaluations by students. And all of the professors, I've read several articles in the past couple months where professors were talking about how students aren't willing to do the work. They're a lot more fragile. The work that they're doing isn't good. They're not able to get it in on time. People are dropping out. People aren't getting the grades that they used to. Like the class average has changed and the professor's using the same tests. Persistence is a problem, right? Because getting into college is a different animal from graduating from it. One of the things that colleges are trying to do is predict persistence, predict who's going to be able to make it through. And critical thinking skills, higher order thinking skills, are measured by the SAT. Higher order thinking skills are positive predictors of college graduation, salary after graduation, and success in life. It stands to reason that if you give the kids a test of critical thinking skills before they get to college and they do well on it, probably better shot at graduating. Everybody has come to this from a good perspective, right? We want to make everything fairer. We want to give everybody a chance. What we are not recognizing, and I hope that this is the beginning of that recognition, is that the solution that we've chosen is not having the effect on the problem that we wish it did. So this takes me to Michael Bloomberg's article, which is entitled, "Colleges Should Bring Back Testing Requirements." MIT brought back testing requirements pretty loudly. Like they sent out a big press release, a bunch of articles about it, and they were like, we don't have the ability to evaluate whether or not a student will be able to succeed at MIT's extremely rigorous curriculum without the SAT scores. They were able to admit and evaluate fewer students of color without the SAT scores. I think what we have not understood up to this point is that the SAT provides a better metric than any of the other highly flawed metrics that exist. Should we come up with another metric? Sure. But what is that? And what are we going to do in the next 5 years when we're letting kids into schools, right? And I want my kids to get into schools for sure. And they're applying now. Michael Bloomberg says this in his article. He uses the National Assessment of Educational Progress, the nation's report card that came out a couple days ago, and talked about 4th and 8th grade math and ELA scores being super low and lower than they'd ever been. So he's talking about that. He's talking about the urgency of interventions and necessity of reinstating testing requirements, partially to make sure that we know what our kids are learning. So this is a really interesting debate, right? And we have a teacher on our staff who was talking to me about how standardized tests are so counterproductive because you spend all this time fatiguing students to take a test that doesn't necessarily measure anything. So what I'm wondering is if we are incorrectly lumping all standardized tests in together. I did a deep dive on a Maryland State test recently for a school that we were working with, and I found the test questions hard to answer and hard to understand. And these were test questions that were intended for like 10th graders. And I was like, wow, these are hard. I don't think I know what they're asking. And granted, I haven't taken a science class in 20 years, but I should be able to at least deconvolute the question that's being asked if I'm able to get a perfect score on the SAT, right? And if that's my bread and butter and that's a thing I do all the time, which it is. I wonder if we are painting all the standardized tests with the same brush and if perhaps that is not appropriate. And perhaps looking at the state tests and looking at the tests that students take in schools is different from looking at the tests that they take to get into college, the SAT and ACT. It does mean something that the scores are going down and we're giving them the same tests, right? That's not good. So one thing he talks about is that average ACT scores have declined every year since 2018, which is the thing I didn't know. With the exception of Asian students, teens of every race perform worse now than they did 5 years ago. So that's scary. You know, if you read the comments on some of these, they talk about how we are competing with other countries who are making education a priority. That's definitely true. We are competing in a global marketplace, and if we are an information-centered economy, tech is our thing, we need a lot of people who are able to think critically, come up with dynamic solutions, do math, and think scientifically as well, right? So it's not good that our kids can't do those things. If anything, removing objective benchmarks risks tilting the process even more towards students from wealthy families by elevating the importance of holistic credentials like extracurricular activities, volunteering, letters of recommendation, and so on. My kids don't have time to do things for free. They have to work. They're often helping to support family. They're often minding younger brothers and sisters. They have a lot of responsibilities besides sort of the free things that wealthy white students have access to. They may not have time for extracurriculars. They may not be able to volunteer. And the letters of recommendation they get, if you're in a school that has one guidance counselor for 500 students and you're one of like 40 students asking your English teacher for a recommendation letter, you're probably going to get a pretty standard template recommendation letter. Is that any of the student's fault? Definitely not. But the student has no ability to distinguish themselves as, yes, I am able to do this without the SAT. There is no way that a student can prove that they have the critical thinking skills to be successful in college without the SAT or ACT. He also says this: reinstating ACT or SAT test requirements would make the admissions process fairer, promote high school accountability, and, not least, help ensure that students are prepared for college once they get there. He's also talking about college persistence, right? The ability to stay in college and make it all the way through. Remediation is one of the biggest problems that we have. If a student has to take remedial classes and they're attending a 2-year college, they only have a 1 in 10 shot, a 10% shot of making it through the remedial class and graduating. Those are sobering numbers, right? Remediation is only sort of obliquely connected to SAT and ACT performance, but the way that we approach the test, the SAT is a test of critical thinking skills and knowledge gaps. So if I can fill in your content holes for the test, those are many of the things that you will need to be successful in college, because certainly on the SAT, it is a good predictor of the things that you'll need to be able to know and need to be able to do. This comes back to the question that I always ask: if preparing the kids to think critically and to know things that they otherwise wouldn't have known that they definitely will need for college is part of SAT prep, then is SAT prep bad? I don't think so. The final point I'll make is something that he says in his penultimate paragraph. The failings of America's education system threaten the country's future as a global leader. In an economy that's more competitive and skills-based than ever, to walk away from standards is to limit students' career opportunities and leave far too many dependent on government to make ends meet. So the last paragraph always makes me think of how we are choosing to prepare or not prepare. You may or may not know this, but students in urban schools often don't have homework. That's for a myriad of reasons. Most of the time, it's because schools and teachers don't think that the homework will get done. Depending on which source you read, there are a variety of statistics you can take away from this. There is definitely a correlation between exploring in school and concretizing at home. So think about math. The math teacher explains a process, shows you a problem on the board. You're like, wow, this is hard. I don't really get this. And then you do a couple more and you're like, well, okay, I think I kind of get this, but I'm not really sure. You go home and you do 40 problems and you're going to figure out if you get it or not. And if you don't get it, after you've done 40 of them, you definitely know what part you don't get, and you can come back and you can figure out what needs to be worked on. Or maybe the first 2 you really struggle with, but then after you've gotten the first 2, you're like, wait, okay, I figured this out. Okay. And then the next 38 become much easier. When schools don't give homework, they are denying the opportunity to concretize information in that way. Sometimes when you talk to teachers, they'll say, oh yeah, we teach about 7 problems on average in a 90-minute block. And you're like, interesting. So these students have access to 7 problems in a day, where students in high SES schools who are going home and doing 40 problems at night are having 47 problems in a day. I don't need to explain the math there. 7 problems versus 47 a day, exponential, builds really quickly. I think one of the things that I am most worried about is that we are cutting off our students' ability to excel because we're kind of ceilinging them and we're saying they're not gonna be able to do more than X amount. And so we do not challenge them, we do not ask them for that. I think that's the spirit of the article that Bloomberg wrote, which is just, we can't put a ceiling on them. We need to continue demanding more and asking more and keeping the bar high. And the more we're able to measure that, the better. Bloomberg's obviously a big fan of measuring stuff. And while I'm not a super big fan of sitting down and taking lots of tests, it is useful to measure. And when we teach the SAT, we give you 5 proctored practice tests, because not only are you measuring where you are and how much you're learning, but you're also getting more comfortable and confident with doing things under a pressurized environment. And that's life, right? Doing stuff under pressure. I do stuff under pressure all the time. It kind of stinks, but you got to do it. Anyway, these are just a few thoughts. I hope the assembled colleges of the United States listen to Michael Bloomberg, and I hope that this Hechinger Report acts as some kind of wake-up call. What I bet is happening, every college is like, ugh, we're having a problem with this, but we're probably the only ones, we suck. But it's not that. They're all having a problem with it. And maybe if a bunch of college presidents read this article and they're like, oh wow, those colleges that I really look up to and think the world of, they're also having the same problem with admissions that we are. Wow, maybe we should bring back a test that actually allows students to prove their mettle. Here's hoping. As always, I am a tireless advocate for our kids, whether they're low SES or high SES, kids who are willing to try deserve the best. Thank you for watching. I'm Alyssa the College Expert, coming to you from Socratic Summer Academy and Ileana Leadership Foundation. For more information about decreasing the opportunity gap and the racial wealth gap, and how we're multiplying the college graduation rate by 8, go to ileana.org. And for more college tips, check out the SocraticSummerAcademy.com/blog. See you soon.